Thomas and Natalie's love story began as something of a surprise, a chance meeting that quickly grew into a whirlwind romance. They met at an intellectual game night, brought together by mutual friends to form a team. Natalie's calm, thoughtful demeanor captivated Thomas immediately, and their connection felt effortless. What started as friendly collaboration soon turned into something more, and within a week, they began dating. Thomas and Natalie were inseparable, their chemistry undeniable. It shocked everyone when, just 3 months later, they announced their plans to marry. Friends and family expressed concern, warning them against rushing into such a significant commitment. Thomas and Natalie were undeterred. Their love felt certain, the kind of bond that made all doubts fade into the background. Rather than hosting an extravagant wedding, they chose simplicity. They signed their marriage certificate at the courthouse and celebrated with a serene trip to the sea. It wasn't about impressing others. It was about the two of them, their love, and the life they envisioned building together. For a year and a half, their life together seemed idyllic. They filled their days with laughter, shared dreams, and an unwavering belief that they had made the right choice. Their small apartment became a sanctuary, a place where their love flourished. They talked often about the future, starting a family, traveling, and pursuing their ambitions together. But life doesn't always follow the script we plan. Circumstances changed unexpectedly, forcing Thomas and Natalie to face a challenge they hadn't anticipated. Thomas received an incredible job offer in a neighboring city, one he couldn't turn down, while Natalie needed to return to her hometown to care for her ailing mother and handle pressing family matters. Though they agreed the separation would be temporary, the weeks stretched into months. At first, they navigated the distance well, buoyed by frequent phone calls, texts, and weekend visits. They remained hopeful, often discussing the day they'd be reunited in their shared home. Together, they dreamed of resuming their life and continuing to build the future they'd envisioned. Yet, the strain of being apart began to take its toll. Natalie found herself overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caring for her mother and managing family conflicts. Her once energetic spirit grew weary, and she felt increasingly isolated. Thomas, too, missed the comfort of having Natalie by his side, though he focused on his work to keep himself occupied. The distance wasn't just physical. Slowly, an emotional gap started to form between them. Their calls, once filled with enthusiasm, became shorter and less frequent. Natalie didn't share as much about her day, and Thomas noticed her growing silence. Each believed the other was simply busy or tired, unaware of the subtle changes that hinted at a deeper shift. What neither of them realized was that this period of separation would test the foundation of their relationship in ways they couldn't have foreseen. The longer Natalie stayed in her hometown, the heavier her burdens became. Caring for her ailing mother consumed her days, and the unresolved family conflicts only added to her stress. She felt trapped, exhausted, and alone, her once vivid dreams of the future with Thomas now clouded by the relentless demands of her present. One afternoon, seeking a brief escape from her daily struggles, Natalie wandered into a small bookstore near her mother's house. It had always been a place of comfort for her, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the written word. As she browsed the shelves, a stranger struck up a conversation with her. His name was Jonathan. He was charming, easygoing, and persistent in a way that made it difficult for Natalie to brush him off. At first, she resisted his attempts to connect, but something about him broke through her defenses. Jonathan recommended books to her, shared a bit about his own life, his education in the capital, his return to their shared hometown, and invited her to coffee. Natalie accepted, not out of romantic interest but because she craved a reprieve from her wearying routine. Over the course of their conversation, Jonathan's humor and intelligence drew her in. He was a skilled conversationalist, and for the first time in weeks, Natalie felt genuinely at ease. When their time together came to an end, Natalie found herself reluctant to leave. Against her better judgment, she asked for Jonathan's contact information. She told herself it was harmless, just a new friend to fill the lonely gaps in her life. Soon, their casual exchanges turned into regular calls and texts. Jonathan brought a spark of joy to Natalie's otherwise monotonous existence. He introduced her to new books, suggested places to visit, and showered her with thoughtful gestures that made her feel special. She started inventing stories to explain her absences to Thomas, saying she had reconnected with an old school friend. It wasn't entirely untrue. Jonathan did feel familiar in a way, though she couldn't quite place why. Their meetings became more frequent. They went to quiet cafes, browsed bookstores, and once, Jonathan took Natalie to a secluded spot by the water to watch the sunset. As they sat together on the shore, talking late into the night, Natalie felt a pull she couldn't ignore. When their conversation turned to deeper, more personal topics, she impulsively kissed him. The kiss marked a turning point. What had started as a friendship had now crossed into an affair. Natalie knew it was wrong, but she justified it to herself, reasoning that she had been under so much pressure and that Jonathan had simply brought her comfort. Meanwhile, Thomas began to sense that something was amiss. Their calls felt distant, devoid of the warmth they once shared. Natalie no longer vented about her family issues or shared her day with him the way she used to. He brushed it off at first, telling himself that her silence was due to exhaustion. But as the weeks went by, the nagging feeling in his gut became harder to ignore. The truth came to light in an unexpected way. Natalie's older sister, Avery, who had always been somewhat antagonistic toward her, saw Natalie leaving a restaurant with a man. From her car, Avery snapped pictures of Natalie and Jonathan embracing tenderly. Avery wasted no time in sending the photos to Thomas. Though the pictures were grainy, the implication was clear. Thomas's heart sank as he studied the images, trying to convince himself there was another explanation. But deep down, he knew. The betrayal hit him like a thunderbolt. For a long time, he sat staring at the photos, his mind racing. Finally, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He took time off work, rented a car, and quietly followed Natalie to see the truth for himself. He didn't have to wait long. That evening, Natalie went out again, and Thomas trailed her to a restaurant. From a distance, he watched her meet Jonathan, the man from the photos, and greet him with a kiss. They sat together, laughing and chatting like a couple. The sight was more than Thomas could bear. His disbelief turned to anger, and without thinking, he walked straight into the restaurant. Thomas entered the restaurant with purpose, his heart pounding as he crossed the threshold. The cozy ambience, warm lighting, and quiet chatter of other diners seemed to mock him, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside. He spotted Natalie immediately. She was sitting across from Jonathan, their heads bent together, laughing softly as they studied the menu. Seeing them like this, so at ease, so intimate, felt like a betrayal far deeper than the photos could convey. Without hesitation, Thomas strode over to their table. The suddenness of his arrival broke the spell. Natalie looked up, her face turning pale as her eyes met his. She froze, her body stiff with shock and panic. Jonathan, oblivious to who Thomas was, seemed startled by the interruption, offering a polite but confused smile. Thomas didn't wait for introductions. He pulled out the chair beside Jonathan and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. He studied Jonathan for a moment, as if sizing him up, then turned his gaze to Natalie. Her expression gave her away, guilt, fear, and shame all written plainly on her face. Thomas spoke calmly, introducing himself as Natalie's husband. His words hung in the air, heavier than the stunned silence that now filled the room. Jonathan's face shifted from confusion to shock. He looked at Natalie, then back at Thomas, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find words that wouldn't come. The tension in the restaurant was palpable. Other diners had stopped eating, their eyes darting between the three of them, captivated by the unfolding drama. Natalie's hands trembled as she reached for her purse, her face flushed with embarrassment. Without saying a word, she stood abruptly and hurried out of the restaurant. Thomas waited a beat, his gaze lingering on Jonathan. The man sat frozen, his body stiff as if bracing for an attack. But Thomas didn't lash out. Instead, he stood and followed Natalie outside, leaving Jonathan to grapple with the weight of the situation on his own. Natalie was pacing on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Thomas approached her, his emotions swirling, anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. He gestured toward the parked car and, after a moment of hesitation, she climbed in. Inside the car, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to contain his emotions. He demanded an explanation, but Natalie avoided his gaze, offering only silence and a shrug of her shoulders. Her indifference struck a nerve. To Thomas, love was binary. You either felt it or you didn't. Her lack of an answer felt like confirmation that she no longer did. He asked her a single, quiet question. Did she still love him? Again, Natalie shrugged, her lack of response cutting deeper than any words could. A wave of calm washed over Thomas, as though the fight had suddenly drained out of him. He started the car and drove toward her parents' house. The realization settled in his mind, clearer than it had ever been. Maybe their rushed marriage had been a mistake all along. When they arrived, he told her plainly that he would bring her belongings over the weekend and that they should begin divorce proceedings. Natalie, seemingly resigned, nodded her agreement. The following days passed in a haze. Thomas packed up her belongings with a quiet efficiency that masked the emotions bubbling underneath. Natalie tried calling Jonathan, but he didn't answer. Eventually, he sent her a brief message, saying he couldn't see her anymore because of the deception surrounding her marriage. The rejection crushed her, leaving her feeling abandoned and adrift. After the divorce was finalized, Natalie made the difficult decision to leave her hometown entirely. The fallout from her actions had severed her ties with both Thomas and her family, particularly her sister Avery, whose intervention had exposed the affair. Natalie moved to the capital, cutting off communication with nearly everyone from her past. Thomas, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding his life. Though the betrayal stung deeply, he recognized that their rushed marriage had been built on shaky ground. The experience left him cautious but also grateful for the lessons it taught him. Through mutual acquaintances, he occasionally heard updates about Natalie, how she had thrown herself into work, how she kept to herself, how she seemed like a different person entirely. These tidbits stirred no longing or anger in him, only a faint sense of closure. Thomas emerged from the ordeal stronger, carrying the knowledge that while love can sometimes falter, life goes on. In the months following the divorce, Thomas worked to piece his life back together. Though the betrayal had left scars, he found strength in focusing on his own growth. He threw himself into his work, reconnected with friends, and embraced the simple joys of life that had once seemed overshadowed by the pain of separation. Natalie's departure from their shared life had been abrupt, but Thomas came to see it as necessary. Their marriage, while full of passion in the beginning, had been rushed and unsteady. The cracks that emerged during their time apart only revealed what had been lying dormant beneath the surface. Occasionally, Thomas thought back to their happier days, brief flashes of laughter and intimacy that once felt unbreakable. But those memories were now distant, softened by time and tempered by the reality of what had transpired. Rather than dwelling on what was lost, he focused on what could still be gained. Through mutual acquaintances, he learned that Natalie had settled into her new life in the capital. She had thrown herself into her work and, true to form, cut ties with nearly everyone from her past, including her family. The few who kept in touch described her as reserved, almost unrecognizable from the vibrant woman she once was. Hearing about her life stirred no anger in Thomas, only a quiet sense of finality. He wished her no ill will but felt no longing to reconnect. Their chapter was closed. For Thomas, moving forward meant rebuilding trust, not only in others but in himself. He took his time before entertaining the idea of a new relationship, knowing that healing wasn't something to rush. When love came again, it would be on a stronger foundation. Life began to feel lighter. He started spending weekends hiking with friends, pursuing hobbies he had put aside, and traveling to places he'd always dreamed of visiting. With each passing day, the weight of the past grew lighter, replaced by the promise of what lay ahead. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about love, communication, and the importance of truly knowing someone before committing to a lifelong partnership. He carried those lessons forward, not as a burden but as a guide. Though their marriage had ended in betrayal, Thomas found peace in knowing he had given it his all. He had loved deeply and without reservation, and while that love wasn't reciprocated in the way he deserved, it had taught him resilience and clarity. As for Natalie, her choices led her down a path far from the one they had once planned together. Whether she found happiness or continued to struggle, Thomas no longer felt responsible for her journey. Their lives had diverged, and he was content to leave it that way. In the end, Thomas realized that life moves on, no matter how painful the detours along the way. With time, he rediscovered the beauty of new beginnings and the strength to embrace the unknown. If you enjoyed this story or found it thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means the world to us.